So I'd begin by saying, even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's Time magazine in 1966. And in the last 18 months, the President of the United States and the Supreme Court have expressed support for gay marriage. And I set out to write Far from the Tree, determined to figure out how that shift had taken place. How did something that was universally understood to be an illness end up being an identity? And if homosexuality could make that relatively definitive switch, still battles, still much to be won, but essentially make that enormous switch, then what are the other conditions that were in line that I thought could possibly make that change? So when I was about 6, I went with my mother and my brother to a shoe store, and when we finished getting our shoes fitted, the salesman told us that we could each have a balloon to take home with us. My brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I'd really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink balloon. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, will give you some evidence of a mother's influence and its limits. That was sort of where my childhood unfolded and the world in which I grew up. And then in about 15 years ago, my editors at the Times Magazine asked me to write about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback. I had thought of deafness entirely as an illness. Those poor people, they couldn't hear. What could we do to help them? And then I went off into the deaf world. And I went to deaf clubs, and I went to deaf theater. I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest in Nashville, Tennessee, where people complained about that slurry Southern signing. And as I immersed myself deeper and deeper in that world, I came to think that it was a culture. Not only that it was a culture, but that it was a very beautiful and seductive culture. I remember arriving at a meeting of the National Association of the Deaf and thinking, I wish I were deaf. Not wishing I couldn't hear, but seeing all of those conversations flying off of people's hands and thinking, I wish I could communicate with all of these people in that way. I wish I knew them all. I wish all those people rushing to hug one another were running to hug me too. It was a very telling moment. And then I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, that those parents, by and large, get those children, try to make those children function in what they think of as the mainstream world, traditionally by placing a huge emphasis on lip reading and oral speech prior to the cochlear implant. And that a lot of those children discover a signing community and deaf culture in adolescence or thereafter when it comes as a great revelation to them. And I thought how similar that was to the experience of gay people who are born to straight parents, who by and large want to get them to function in some kind of established straight world because they think it's the normal and happier way to go. And how often those gay children discover gay culture in adolescence or thereafter when it comes as a great revelation. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And suddenly all of these questions seemed to be coming up again. It turns out most dwarfs are born to parents of average height. And this woman I know was saying, do I tell her she's just like everyone else but kind of short? Or do I somehow get involved in dwarf culture and join the little people of America and try to give her a sense of dwarf identity? And that bewilderment echoed again this idea that I had had previously. And so I hatched the idea that there are really two kinds of identities. There are vertical identities passed down generationally from parent to child. One's ethnicity, one's nationality, usually one's language, often one's religion. These are things parents are likely to have in common with their children. And no matter how difficult any of those identities may be, there is no movement to try to fix or eliminate them. There is rather a movement to try to get society to accommodate them. Nobody is working on ensuring that the next generation of children born to African American parents come out with blonde hair and blue eyes because that's actually an easier way to live in this country as it's currently constructed, the current presidency notwithstanding. But then there are what I've called horizontal identities. Horizontal because they're learned from a peer group, and those would include deafness and dwarfism and gayness and many of the other things that I looked at. Josh gave you the whole list of them. All of these situations in which a family that sees itself as essentially at some level normal has a child who is at some level abnormal. And as I investigated this, I became very interested in the role of family in defining the experiences of those children and the ways in which those children defined experience for themselves. And I became struck by the idea that there are two things often conflated but not the same that occur ideally between parents and children. And one is love, and the other one is acceptance. And love ideally should be there from the moment the baby arrives. And while we all know stories of hideous abuse, my general experience is that most parents actually love their children. But acceptance is a process, and it always takes time. It takes time even when your child isn't schizophrenic or autistic or transgender. It takes time simply because your child is an independent person, and getting to know your child is a long and complicated undertaking. And so I became interested in the idea that while acceptance, I think, must be the ultimate goal of love, it's not the same. And that was very liberating for me because I had sometimes felt unloved when my parents initially had some difficulties with my being gay. And I realized that they always loved me and that they took a little while to accept me, and that all in all, and comparatively speaking, they got there pretty quickly, and that it's a process everyone goes through.